They laughed before he even spoke, a room filled with marble floors, polished shoes, and people who had never been told no looked down at one small black boy and decided the outcome immediately. They saw his clothes, they saw his age, they saw where he came from. What they didn't see was the notebook in his bag, or the years he had spent alone in libraries no one else visited, or the fact that the problem they'd been arguing about for decades had already been solved. Not by a professor, not by a panel, but by the kid they were laughing at, and in just a few hours. Every assumption in that room was about to collapse. This is the story of Preston Davis. A story about what happens when the world tells you no before you even begin. A story about the dangerous intersection of brilliance and poverty. A story about how easily we dismiss genius when it doesn't arrive in the package we expect, but most. Of all, this is a story about the moment when truth becomes undeniable. When a child stands before a room full of experts and proves that intelligence has no prerequisites. No dress code, no zip code, no pedigree, what you're about to hear will. Challenge everything you think you know about potential. Because sometimes the greatest minds aren't found in ivy-covered halls. Sometimes they're sitting alone in public libraries, wearing clothes that don't fit, solving problems that adults have given up on. And sometimes those minds change everything, * Preston. Davis was 10 years old and smaller than most kids in his class. He lived on the south side of Chicago with his grandmother in a quiet apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The paint peeled in the corners, the heating worked when it wanted to, the elevator broke more often than it ran. But none of that mattered to Preston. His grandmother, Miss Dorothy, worked double shifts at a hospital cleaning rooms that people with money would never see. She came home exhausted, smelling like industrial cleaner and sacrifice, but she never came home without asking Preston about his day. She never came home without checking his homework. His clothes came from cousins who had outgrown them years ago, shirts with faded logos, pants held up with belts that wrapped around twice, shoes that squeaked when he walked because the solace had separated from wear. His backpack had faded superheroes on it, characters he'd loved when he was 6. The zipper didn't work properly anymore. He had to safety pin it closed. His eyesight wasn't great, but glasses weren't something his family could afford. So Preston sat in the front row of every class, squinting at boards that blurred after the 3rd line. Teachers thought he was eager. He was just trying to see. What Preston did have was time. Time in public libraries. Time with books no one else checked out. Time with questions grown people argued about instead of answering. The Harold Washington Library became his second home, while other kids played basketball in parks with broken nets or gathered on corners with nothing productive to do. Preston climbed the stairs to the math and science section on the 4th floor. The librarian, Mr. Chen, an elderly man with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly when he shelved books, noticed Preston immediately, a 10-year-old requesting college-level mathematics texts. A child who returned books with notes written on borrowed paper? A mind? That asked questions most graduate students couldn't articulate. Mr. Chun stopped treating Preston like a child after the 2nd week. He started treating him like a scholar. He began setting aside books before Preston even asked. Complex analysis, number theory, abstract algebra, textbooks with price tags that would have fed Preston's family for a month. Preston absorbed everything. While his classmates struggled with basic arithmetic, carrying numbers, remembering multiplication tables, understanding fractions, Preston filled cheap notebooks with symbols most adults wouldn't recognize. Sigma notation, limit proofs, differential equations. He didn't do it to impress anyone. No one was watching. He did it because something bothered him. Years earlier, when he was only 7, he had found a dusty book describing a famous mathematical dispute. The cover was water damaged. The pages smelled like basement. Someone had returned it 15 years ago, and no one had checked it out since. The book described 2 celebrated professors, Professor Edmund Hargrove from Cambridge, Professor Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo. Brilliant minds separated by an ocean and united by an obsession. For 30 years, they had fought over a single problem. A question about prime number distribution that seemed simple on the surface but revealed impossible complexity the deeper you went. Both men had published hundreds of pages. Both had devoted their careers to proving the other wrong. Neither had succeeded. The mathematical community had split into camps. Conferences became battlegrounds. Academic journals published rebuttals of rebuttals. Careers were built on choosing sides. Reputations were destroyed for switching allegiances. Preston didn't understand why smart people would fight that long without finding the truth. To him, math wasn't about ego, it wasn't about being right. It was about discovering what actually existed beneath the arguments. So he decided to try. Night after night, he worked through their papers using photocopies Mr. Chen made for him, using scratch paper from the library's recycling bin, using pencils. Sharpened down to nubs. He read Hargrove's original thesis. He studied Tanaka's counterproofs. He followed every branching path of logic. And slowly, something started to bother him, a feeling he couldn't name. A sense that both men were wrong, not in their math, but in their assumptions. They were both solving different versions of the same problem. Neither version was complete by the time he qualified for a statewide mathematics competition. Preston wasn't chasing a trophy, he didn't even care about winning. He was chasing an answer. He wanted to know if what he'd found was real. He wanted someone who understood to tell him if he'd actually solved it, but the people running the competition saw something else. They saw a child who didn't belong. Asterisk, the competition took place at Northwestern University, where history stared down from the walls. Portraits of wealthy donors, names carved into stone, generations of power preserved in oil paint and marble, buildings that cost more than entire neighborhoods. Classrooms with equipment Preston's school couldn't imagine. Hallways that echoed with privilege. Preston walked in holding his grandmother's hand. She had taken the day off work, unpaid, to bring him. She wore her church dress, the nice one she saved for funerals and important occasions. She wanted Preston to know this mattered. Heads turned immediately, some out of curiosity, most out of disbelief. A black woman in a worn dress, a black child in clothes that didn't match. Walking into a space designed to keep people like them out. The registration desk was staffed by graduate students in pressed clothing. They processed applications with mechanical efficiency until Preston approached. Then everything slowed down. One of them, a young woman with perfect posture and expensive jewelry, looked at Preston's paperwork like it was contaminated. Is this correct? 10 years old? Elementary school? She said it loud enough for others to hear, not as a question, as a judgment. Miss Dorothy's grip tightened on Preston's shoulder. She had faced this her entire life. She knew what was happening. But she also knew Preston belonged here. The boy had qualified. The scores didn't lie. At registration, one of the senior professors noticed the commotion and stopped everything. Professor Richard Whitmore, 63 years old, director of the university's mathematics department, recipient of prestigious awards Preston couldn't pronounce. A man who had spent 40 years in rooms exactly like this one. A man who had never been questioned. A man who had never been told he didn't belong. Asterisk, the boy's presence wasn't read as ambition. It was read as a mistake. Professor Whitmore skimmed Preston's paperwork with visible irritation. In elementary school, 10 years old, South Side, everything about the application seemed wrong to him. Not because the scores were low, but because they were too high. Asterisk, who helped you with the qualifier? Professor Whitmore asked. The question landed like an accusation. Preston looked up at the man. No one helped me, sir. I worked alone. These problems require advanced knowledge. Knowledge typically acquired in high school or beyond. You're telling me you taught yourself? Asterisk, yes, sir. Professor Whitmore didn't believe him. Belief would have required reconsidering everything he thought he knew about intelligence, about access, about who deserved to be in rooms like this. Belief would have required empathy when Preston's notebook slipped from his bag and hit the floor. Professor Whitmore picked it up before Preston could reach it. The professor flipped through the pages. The mood shifted. Asterisk, what had started as annoyance turned into amusement. Page after page of complex notation, formulas that looked legitimate, but seemed absurd coming from a child. And then, near the back, Preston's notes on the Hargrove-Tanaka problem. Professor Whitmore's face changed. He recognized what he was looking at. He recognized the problem. He recognized the audacity. A poor black kid claiming to have solved a problem that had defeated experts for decades. He made sure others were watching before drawing attention to what the boy had written. He framed it as entertainment. A joke. Ladies and gentlemen. Professor Whitmore announced to the gathering crowd, "We have a child here who believes he solved the Hargrove-Tanaka conjecture. He said it the way you'd announce a magic trick. Not with respect, with mockery. The laughter spread fast. Adults laughed. Teen competitors laughed. People with titles and degrees laughed. Graduate students who should have known better laughed. Professors who claimed to value inquiry laughed. Even some parents laughed. Preston didn't laugh. He stood still while his work was reduced to a punchline. While people who had never opened a book like his decided his limits for him, while the world reminded him that his brilliance didn't matter if it came wrapped in the wrong skin, Miss Dorothy stepped forward. My grandson is here because he qualified. He earned his place. And if you take the time to actually read his work instead of laughing at it, you might learn something. Her voice didn't shake. Her dignity didn't crack. Professor Whitmore dismissed her with a look. Ma'am, I'm sure your grandson is very bright. But this problem has consumed some of the greatest minds in mathematics. Perhaps it's best if we focus on age-appropriate material. That moment was recorded. Someone in the crowd had their phone out. The interaction was captured in vertical video, shaky footage with mediocre audio, but clear enough to see everything. The condescension, the dismissal, the public humiliation, it was uploaded within minutes, posted to Twitter, shared on Facebook, sent through group chats, and overnight. The internet split in two. One side laughed with the room. They made memes about delusional parents. They joked about participation trophy culture. They shared the video with commentary about kids these days. The other side started paying attention. Black parents who had watched their children dismissed. Educators who recognized bias when they saw it. Mathematicians who remembered being underestimated. They didn't laugh, they waited. When the first round began, competitors were scattered across different rooms based on age groups. Preston was placed with the youngest participants, students who were still mastering pre-algebra. The problems were meant to challenge middle schoolers. Preston finished in 8 minutes. Perfect score. The proctor thought there was an error. No one finishes that fast. She checked his work 3 times. Looking for mistakes. Finding none, people shrugged it off. Luck, guessing, charity. Maybe the problems were too easy. Maybe the answers were obvious. Maybe he'd seen something similar before. The second round required proofs, real work, the kind that exposed understanding, the kind you couldn't fake. Competitors were brought to a lecture hall with chalkboards spanning entire walls. They would present their solutions publicly, one at a time, with judges watching when Preston's turn came. He approached the board standing on a chair because he couldn't reach otherwise. The image alone triggered more quiet laughter. A small boy on a chair wearing shoes that were too big, holding chalk in hands that barely wrapped around it. Then he started writing. His approach wasn't standard. It didn't follow the expected path. He introduced variables from different mathematical frameworks. He combined techniques in ways that seemed improper, that unsettled the judges. One of them interrupted him publicly, insisting he was doing it wrong. Young man, that's not the conventional method. If you're going to present, please use standard notation. Preston didn't argue. He simply continued. Minutes later, another professor reviewed the work and froze. What the child had written wasn't just correct. It was elegant. More than that, it revealed something missing. A constraint no one had noticed, a boundary condition that changed everything. The laughter died in place. Whispers replaced it. Confusion, recognition, embarrassment. By the end of the round, the competition wasn't a novelty anymore. It was a threat, not a threat to the participants. A threat to the hierarchy. Because if this child could do what he was doing, what did that say about everyone who had dismissed him? What did that say about the systems designed to keep people like him out? And the man whose name was attached to the unsolved problem was watching very closely. Professor Edmund Hargrove had flown in from Cambridge specifically for this event. He was supposed to deliver a keynote speech. He was supposed to inspire the next generation instead. He was watching his life's work get dissected by a 10-year-old asterisk that night. The rules quietly changed. The organizing committee met behind closed doors. Professor Whitmore insisted they had to maintain standards. He argued that letting Preston advance would set a dangerous precedent. We can't have children thinking they can skip years of proper education. We can't validate this kind of behavior. But he wasn't worried about education. He was worried about exposure. Professor Hargrove sat in that meeting and made a decision that would haunt him. Let him try the real problem. Let's see what he does with the conjecture itself. If he's as brilliant as he thinks, he'll solve it. If not, this ends. It was a trap disguised as an opportunity. The final problem was replaced. Instead of a standard challenge appropriate for the competition level, the judges introduced the infamous 30-year debate itself, the same problem that had built careers and broken reputations. The problem that had no accepted solution. It was supposed to be impossible. It was supposed to expose the boy. It was supposed to restore order. The announcement came the next morning. Finalists gathered in a grand auditorium, cameras had been set up overnight, news outlets had heard about the controversy, the live stream was promoted across social media. What had started as a regional mathematics competition had become a spectacle. Cameras rolled, live stream numbers climbed. The world watched as 8 finalists sat on stage. 7 teenagers in tailored blazers, kids from private schools with dedicated math teams, kids whose parents hired tutors, kids who had been groomed for this since elementary school, and one 10-year-old in hand-me-down clothes. When the problem appeared on the screen, the room reacted like it had been punched. Even people who didn't understand mathematics recognized the name, the Hargrove-Tanaka conjecture. Unsolvable, unfinished, untouchable, one of the teenage finalists. A 17-year-old who had won state competitions for 3 consecutive years. Stood up immediately. This isn't fair. This isn't what we prepared for. This is a graduate-level problem. Professor Whitmore responded from his seat. Mathematics doesn't care about fairness. It cares about truth. If you can't attempt. You're welcome to withdraw. He was looking at Preston when he said it. The message was clear. Withdraw now. Save yourself the embarrassment. Accept your place. Preston didn't move. The timer started 3 hours for nearly an hour. The other finalists struggled. Pages filled with dead ends. Confidence drained from faces. One by one, they gave up. The 17-year-old who had protested earlier threw his pencil down after 40 minutes. He had written 3 pages of work. All of it circular, none of it progress. Others followed. By the 90-minute mark, 6 of the 8 finalists had stopped working. They sat in their chairs, defeated, watching Preston. Preston kept writing. His notebook filled with diagrams, equations sprawled across pages, notes in margins too small to read from the audience. Then he stopped. His pencil hovered. His body stiffened. There was a gap. For the first time, doubt hit him hard. He had followed Hargrove's logic to its natural conclusion. He had traced Tanaka's counter-argument to its foundation, and he had found the place where both men made the same mistake. But there was a piece missing, a connection he couldn't see, a step he couldn't justify. Cameras zoomed in, viewers assumed. The story was ending the way they expected. The kid had flown too close. The sun had burned him. The natural order was restoring itself. In the audience, Miss Dorothy prayed silently. She didn't understand the mathematics. She didn't need to. She understood her grandson. She knew that look on his face. He was stuck. But then something shifted. Preston closed his eyes, he thought. About Mr. Chen, about the library, about the quiet afternoons when no one expected anything from him. He thought about the question that had bothered him for years. Why would smart people fight for 30 years without finding truth? And suddenly he saw it. The gap wasn't a failure. It was the answer. The missing piece wasn't missing at all. It was hiding in plain sight. Disguised as the foundation both men had accepted without question. Preston recognized the gap for what it was. Not a failure. A missing piece. The same hidden constraint he had noticed years earlier. The one both sides of the debate had overlooked because they were too busy defending positions. Instead of questioning assumptions, they had both assumed the problem existed in standard Euclidean space. They had both accepted classical definitions of distribution. They had both built their proofs on a foundation that didn't apply. The problem required a different framework. Entirely, when time was called, no one expected what came next. Preston climbed onto the chair again and began presenting. He didn't perform. He didn't dramatize. He didn't play to the cameras. He explained, step by step. He reconstructed the entire debate. He showed Hargrove's initial approach, elegant but incomplete. He showed Tanaka's counterproof, brilliant but flawed. He showed exactly where both men had diverged from truth. Not because they were stupid, but because they were human. Because they had invested too much to turn back. Because they had built identities around being right. Because admitting the problem required different tools meant admitting wasted decades. He introduced the missing variable, a boundary condition from topology, a constraint from non-Euclidean geometry. A bridge between frameworks that mathematicians rarely crossed. He carried the logic forward until there was nowhere left to argue. At the bottom of the board, he wrote the final line, QED, quaderat demonstrandum. That which was to be demonstrated, silence, the kind of silence that feels physical, that presses against your chest, that makes you forget how to breathe. One professor stood up slowly and approached the board, Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in number theory from MIT. She had published papers on the Hargrove-Tanaka problem herself. She checked the math, line by line, variable by variable, assumption by assumption. Then another professor joined her, then another, then another. The man who had laughed at him earlier, Professor Whitmore, reached the board last, scanning desperately. For a flaw, his finger traced Preston's logic, his lips moved silently, his face drained of color. There wasn't one. The proof held. Dr. Chun turned to face the audience. It's correct. Those two words changed everything. A 10-year-old had just ended a 30-year argument. Asterisk, the room stood up without being told. Applause broke out slowly, then all at once. Not the polite clapping of ceremony, but the thunderous recognition of witnessing history. Phones were raised, messages sent, headlines drafted in real time. Child prodigy solves decades-old mathematical mystery. 10-year-old succeeds where PhDs failed. Southside boy becomes youngest person to solve major conjecture. What followed happened just as fast. Someone leaked that the finals problem had been changed intentionally, that the original final round had been replaced specifically to humiliate Preston, that Professor Whitmore and Professor Hargrove had conspired to expose what they saw as a fraud. The backlash was immediate. Northwestern University released a statement within hours, distancing themselves from Professor Whitmore, praising Preston's achievement, promising an investigation into the competition's conduct, but the damage was done. The video of Professor Whitmore mocking Preston's notebook had been viewed millions of times. Academic Twitter erupted. Mathematicians from every major university weighed in. Some defended Preston, some questioned the legitimacy, some demanded independent verification. Professor Hargrove, who had spent 30 years defending his position, released a statement that evening, brief, professional, devastating. Preston Davis has identified what I could not. His proof is sound. I was wrong. Those 4 words, I was wrong, cost him everything he had built, but they also freed him. The proof was formally submitted to the Journal of Pure Mathematics within a week. 3 independent review boards examined it. All 3 confirmed what Dr. Chen had recognized immediately. It was correct, it was elegant, it was revolutionary. The proof was named after Preston, not as a gesture, not as charity, as a correction. The Davis constraint, a mathematical principle that would appear in textbooks for generations. A theorem that would reshape how mathematicians approached entire fields of study. When Professor Whitmore finally faced Preston again, it was at a formal apology organized by the university. Cameras were not allowed, the meeting was private, there was no defense left, prestige didn't matter, authority didn't matter, degrees didn't matter, the math spoke. Preston sat across from the man who had humiliated him. Miss Dorothy sat beside her grandson, her hand on his shoulder. Her presence a reminder that Preston had never been alone. Professor Whitmore struggled to find words. I underestimated you. I let my assumptions blind me to your ability. I'm sorry. The apology was real. The shame was real. The regret was real, but so was the damage. Preston looked at the man and saw something most adults never recognize in themselves. Fear. Professor Whitmore hadn't mocked Preston because he thought the boy was stupid. He mocked Preston because he was terrified of what it meant if the boy was brilliant. If a poor black child from the South Side could solve what Cambridge professors couldn't, then what did that say about merit? About access? About who deserves opportunities? Asterisk, it meant the system was broken. It meant talent was everywhere, but opportunity wasn't. It meant people like Professor Whitmore had been gatekeeping genius while claiming to cultivate it, Preston. Didn't gloat, he didn't shame anyone, he forgave. Not because the humiliation hadn't hurt, it had. Not because the mockery didn't matter, it did. But because he understood something many adults never learn, truth doesn't need permission. Thank you for the apology, sir. I hope other kids like me get judged by their work instead of their circumstances. That evening, Preston walked out of the building holding his grandmother's hand. The trophy was too heavy for him to carry, so Miss Dorothy held it. They took the bus home, same route they always took, same stops, same faces, but everything was different. The apartment on the south side hadn't changed. The peeling paint was still there, the heating still worked when it wanted to. But now there were offers, full scholarships to private schools, invitations to mathematics programs, requests for interviews, universities that had never heard of Preston. Davis were now competing to secure his future. Mr. Chun from the library called to congratulate him. His voice shook with pride. He had always known. He had seen it from the beginning. Preston's classmates treated him differently. Some with admiration, some with jealousy, some with confusion. He was still the same kid, still quiet, still more comfortable with books than people. But now he was also a symbol, a reminder that brilliance doesn't wait for permission. That genius doesn't care about poverty. That intelligence can't be predicted by zip codes or clothing brands. Preston didn't talk about legacy. He didn't talk about fame. He didn't talk about changing the world. He talked about going back to the library because there were more problems to solve, more questions to ask, more assumptions to challenge. Somewhere across the country, another kid watched that live stream. Another child who had been laughed at, another kid told they didn't belong, another young mind dismissed before being heard. A girl in rural Appalachia who loved chemistry but whose school didn't offer advanced classes, a boy in Detroit who taught himself programming on a donated computer, a teenager in Los Angeles who wrote poetry that adults called unrealistic. They watched Preston Davis climb onto that chair. They watched him write on that board. They watched him prove that being underestimated isn't the end of the story, asterisk, sometimes it's the beginning, and for the first time, they saw proof, not mathematical proof, not logical proof, lived proof, that their circumstances didn't define their ceiling, that poverty wasn't a measure of potential, that the world's low expectations didn't have to become their reality. Preston's story spread beyond mathematics. Teachers began questioning how they evaluated students. Schools began examining their gifted programs. Communities began demanding better access to resources. Because if one child could do this without support, how many more could thrive with it? How much genius was being wasted because we couldn't see past our own biases? How many solutions to world problems were locked inside minds we'd already dismissed? The questions were uncomfortable. The answers were more uncomfortable. Asterisk, but they were necessary. 3 months after the competition, Preston returned to Northwestern University. Not as a curiosity, not as a charity case. As a guest lecturer, he stood in the same auditorium where he'd been humiliated. He looked out at the same kind of crowd that had laughed at him. But this time they were silent before he spoke. This time they were listening. Preston talked about the Davis constraint. He talked about the mathematics. He talked about the proof. But he also talked about something else. The hardest part wasn't the math. The hardest part was believing I had the right to try. That sentence hung in the air. Everyone told me I was too young. Asterisk, too poor. Too unprepared. From the wrong neighborhood. The wrong background. The wrong everything. But math doesn't care about any of that. Truth doesn't care about any of that. The only thing that mattered was whether I was right. He paused and I was. The applause that followed wasn't for the proof. It was for the courage to try when everyone expected you to fail. The courage to stand when everyone wanted you to sit. The courage to speak when everyone told you to be quiet. Miss Dorothy watched from the front row. She thought about all the double shifts, all the sacrificed time, all the nights she came home too tired to move, and she knew it was worth it. Every single moment. Preston Davis would go on to solve 6 more major problems before graduating high school. He would publish papers that reshaped fields. He would win awards with names most people can't pronounce. He would become one of the most celebrated mathematicians of his generation. But none of those achievements would matter as much as that first one. Not because it was the most important mathematically, but because it proved something more fundamental, that genius doesn't ask permission, that brilliance doesn't wait for invitation, that intelligence doesn't need validation from people who can't recognize it, and that sometimes the people we underestimate are the ones who change everything. Preston still visits the library, still sits in the same section, still pulls books no one else checks out, still fills notebooks with questions because solving one problem didn't stop him from asking more. And every time a kid walks into that library looking lost, looking for something they can't name, looking for proof that they belong, Mr. Chen tells them the same thing. There was a boy who used to sit right where you are. Everyone told him he couldn't. He did it anyway. And somewhere in Chicago, in classrooms and libraries and apartments where the heating doesn't always work, kids are solving problems. Kids are asking questions. Kids are refusing to accept the limits other people place on them because they saw what happened when one boy wouldn't stop believing. They saw what happened when truth became undeniable. They saw what happened when a room full of people who laughed, went silent,